From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you Unconquered. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, by Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, bringing you the best mortgage origination and just a boutique service to walk you through the home acquisition process. Give them a holler if you're in Florida, Tennessee, or Kentucky. All right, we're running a little late this week in terms of preview and other things. Didn't get another one out. And if you can hear in my voice, I'm a little under the weather right now, so excuse any coughing or anything else that happens during the recording of this episode. But this is the Miami of Florida preview. Florida State going to play Miami of Florida on Saturday in a game that, quite frankly, doesn't look real good for Florida State coming in. And it's amazing how much things have sort of flipped in the past 9 months, because a year ago, Florida State was miles ahead of Miami in terms of program momentum, in terms of all sorts of things. And then just all of that has seemingly dissipated over the past 9 months. So it's going to be a game where, you know, Florida State's very much playing for pride at this point, and Miami's playing for a lot more. Nevertheless, this is a game where, as we'll talk about, there are some paths to some interesting results here, but there aren't a bunch of them. So we'll get to that. But before I do that, I do want to address a question or two from the mailbag. This one was a really interesting one from John Felchner. It says, he said, Doc, is it feasible to say that on drops alone, this team is 5-2 if you take away those drops? This team is very much unideal. They can't block, can't defend consistently, but man, the drops have been most killing. You know, I went back and thought about this, and I think that actually might be right. This team might be 5-2 if you pulled out the most damaging drops. You don't even have to eliminate all the drops. If you just pulled out the most damaging drops on the season, this team's probably 5-2. So you go back to game 1, said it after that game, that if Cam Davis catches that ball in the flat, that game probably ends with a Florida State win. That changed the game. And there was at least one other one in that game. I'm trying to remember. Malik Benson had one in that game that was big. So those are 2 in that one, and that probably flips that game. Then you move to the next one, and Kyle Morlock had 2 against Boston College that probably cost Florida State that game. So, okay, that's two games that are reversed there. I think. Okay, we could just go back to last week, and I think you win last week without 2. I mean, you don't even have to reverse all 3, but you got 2 just dreadful drops with Benson on the one that probably scores, and then the one on the dime thrown by Luke Kromenhoek. So that flips that game. So now you've got wins against Georgia Tech, Boston College, and Duke. And then the only one left is Memphis, and I think that one, you had 1 or 2 in that one that might have flipped that game. So I think at worst, if you just have guys catch balls that they're supposed to catch, and not even all the ball, not even eliminating all drops, just the ones, the crucial ones that have really cost you, I think you're 4-3 at worst right now. You're probably 5-2. Yeah, so I think that's true. I think that's really, and that's a really interesting point. Now, I don't think you're beating SMU or Clemson without the drops in those games, though the SMU game gets real interesting if you don't have the Morlock off the face mask turns into a major swing in that game, interception. But yeah, I don't think you're winning either of those games probably, but yeah, I think 4-3 or 5-2 is probably right with the drops out, and I think that further illustrates how tight, how close the margins are in college football. And, we're seeing this all over the place. Michigan, a lot of people have used Florida State's 1-6 start as evidence that they didn't belong in the college football playoff last year. But look at Michigan. Michigan won it all last year, and that's a team that had to escape against Arkansas State. They're one play away from a loss against USC. They're one play away from a loss against Minnesota. They got beat by Washington and lost embarrassingly to Illinois last week. Just completely toothless last week. I mean, that's a team that's 2 or 3 plays away from being, instead of 4-3, from being, say, 2-5. And they're about to play Michigan State, Oregon, and Indiana in back-to-back-to-back weeks. They may well not make a bowl. So, it's a new era in college football in certain ways. And we are seeing, I think, some of the differences here in terms of it's a little bit harder to sustain long-term success than it was in the pre-NIL and transfer portal era. And this actually gets to another question. James Reeves asked, is college ball entering an NFL economy where you can win the Super Bowl, lose your best players to free agency, and then finish 3-13 the next year? Kansas, Oklahoma State, and then national champion Michigan might not win 5 games this year, and big spending USC is way underperforming. Is this an aberration? And, I think there's something to that. It used to be that if you were a dominant recruiter, that insulated you against, down seasons. You look at Alabama under Saban. You look at Florida State before that under Coach Bowden. Those programs, because of just bringing in consistently more talent than everybody else had in every class, you could sustain long-term success year in, year out. I do think that's harder to do now because more guys transfer out. And I think the place where this is the hardest to make it work is at quarterback. If you look at Michigan, the biggest difference between Michigan this year and last year is they can't throw the football. They're just not good enough at quarterback. Last year, they were really dependable with McCarthy at quarterback. And this year, Florida State is not in a place where the quarterbacks are the eraser for them. The drop from what you had with Jordan Travis to where things have been is pretty significant. And I say that knowing that, and I've said this most of the year, quarterback's not the primary problem with Florida State right now. You got bigger problems on offense. Again, going back to the drops, even if you have a quarterback who's putting the ball on the money, if you can't catch the football, it doesn't matter very much. Offensive line and wide receiver and tight end, before they got the young guys out there, have been bigger problems than the quarterback position this year. And, when DJU is out there, the problem was that he was just not an eraser who could compensate for some of the weaknesses in those other spots. And that's the thing. If you have a, Patrick Mahomes in the NFL, you can be weaker at a lot of different spots and still manage to make it work because that guy's an eraser. He just makes you so much better that he's going to raise the level of play around him. In the past, you look at going back to Coach Bowden, Florida State, how many years did they start the first start for a new quarterback was junior year, redshirt junior year. You got a 4th-year guy who was a top recruit coming out who learned for 3-4 years before he ever stepped foot on the field. Those days are gone. And it's just much, much harder to sustain consistent success when you have a new quarterback and you're rolling the dice every year or two, because when a guy doesn't win the job, he transfers elsewhere. And then you get an injury, or one guy doesn't work out, or a guy moves on to the NFL 1 year too soon, and all of a sudden you got problems. All of a sudden you have an offense that doesn't have a trigger man that is super reliable. So I think that's a big factor as well. But that's just one position, and I think that you do see elements of that at every spot, where in the past you could build depth because guys were going to be on your roster, and you could rely on that depth. And now it's just not quite the same. And now you lose some of the guys that you might lose in a given year. You get 10 guys, 11 guys drafted, and it's harder to recover from that than it used to be. And the teams that you're playing against are pulling guys from, group of 5 programs and lower level programs and so on, and plugging them in, and they're more competitive. As you get this player movement, this is resulting in more competitive games against lower level teams than there used to be. I think the overall talent gap across the board, with the exception of a few of the very best teams at the absolute top, and even there, I think there's a little bit more parity than there used to be. I think that has changed. You look at a program like Duke, for example, and look at how many guys they lost after last year and how many they brought in from elsewhere, and where those guys have made a difference and have been, highly talented players, have been solid players for them. That never would have happened in a prior era. It's just not the same. And so, yeah, I think the margins are tighter now than they have been. And one little thing, if you have receivers who suddenly can't catch the football for whatever reason, it makes a difference. And I was thinking about this earlier this week as well. Think about how different this year looks if Destin Hill doesn't go down with injury. If you've got Destin Hill out there, how much does that change Florida State's passing game right up front, right away? Because I think he's your number one immediately. If he's healthy, he comes into the year as your number one, and Benson becomes kind of 1A, and you kind of move everybody, you bump everybody, and Hill's a guy that's going to catch the ball reliably. So suddenly, does that take you to 5-2 or 4-3 just by not having Destin Hill go down with injury? Think about how impactful that injury has been because of the inefficacy of Florida State's passing game. And that's a guy that they trusted. That's a guy that was expected to come in and be a major contributor this year. Yeah, I think that's a big factor. So it's going to be really interesting to see moving forward how quickly you can recover from something like this as well. Because if the margins are that tight, if they're that slim, and it really is a matter of, filling just a handful of small gaps that you got to fix, and all of a sudden you go from being 1-6 to 5-2 or 6-1, is that something that you can flip around that quickly? Is that something that in 1 year, all of a sudden you go from a 1-6 start to a 6-1 start next year? It's a good question. Okay, so now it's time to get to the thing that we have been sort of putting off, avoiding, not really wanting to do, and that is the actual preview part of this podcast. Because, quite frankly, it doesn't look real good. So this is a Miami team that has been on a tear, 7-0, and they've been running the football. They've been throwing it well. They have scored a lot of points. And I mean, in some sense, you could probably turn this podcast episode off right here because it boils down to this. Miami is averaging 47 points a game against FBS competition, and which is number 1 in the country, and 42.5 points per game against Power 4 competition, which is number 4 nationally, versus Florida State averaging 15.5 points per game against Power 4 competition, Power 3 competition, and being 128th, I think it is, against FBS competition, again averaging 15.5 or 15.0 points per game, 128th when you Look at what they're averaging overall against FBS competition. Y'all, in a lot of ways, this game to me just boils down to I don't believe Florida State's going to score enough points to beat a Miami team that even against a good defense is going to score points. They're going to score. And I'm not convinced Florida State can score well enough to really win this game. Now, is there a path to victory? Sure. We'll talk about that. But just putting it up front, Miami's averaging over 40 points a game. Florida State has only scored over 20 once. That's what you're looking at. That's the problem. And I don't think pretty much the rest of what we're going to talk about is going to change that fundamental problem. Nevertheless, let's just take a little bit of a closer look. Miami is going to run the football as they do. That's what Cristobal wants to do. And they've got a bunch of guys on this offense that are big backs that cause problems for you in the run game. Damian Martinez, their leading rusher, the transfer from Oregon State, 230 pounds. He's an absolute load between the tackles. And then along with him, you've got Mark Fletcher, who has been averaging, he's actually been the more dynamic player between the two of them, another 220-pound plus back. Damian Martinez averaging just under 5 a carry, Mark Fletcher averaging just under 6 a carry. Jordan Lyle, their freshman, is averaging 7.2 per carry. Cam Ward has been effective as a runner, 5.4 yards per carry. A.J. Allen, who they saw last year and gave a little bit of trouble last year, 7.9 yards per carry. That's 5 guys that are over 170 rushing yards on the season. Just for perspective, Florida State right now has one guy over 170 yards rushing, and that's Toafili, who's 253 yards. And Florida State has one guy on the roster who has more than 3 carries and is averaging over 4 yards a carry, and that's Brock Glenn at 4.43 yards per carry. It's pretty simple there. Miami has been efficient running the football. They're big on the offensive line. They've got a lot of beef they'll throw at you in that respect, and they've got big backs. They'll run duo, where you're getting double teams on each of the defensive tackles. They'll run a lot of inside zone. They're going to come straight downhill at you, and then they'll mix that with some other stuff. They'll run some read stuff. They'll run some counter, some of those concepts. Pretty diverse in the running game, and they do a good job. They get guys moved, and one of the things that they did a lot of, say, against Louisville, is that they isolated the linebackers. So they just made sure, and this is one of the things that Miami will do, is they'll double your defensive tackles just to get them out of the way, and then rely on their backs to beat your linebackers. And given how Florida State's linebackers have been this year, that's not the worst approach in the world. So, that's going to be phase 1. Can you stop the run game and how physical they've been? And you look at their game log, you look at what they've done this year, 5.48 yards per carry against Louisville, 4.18 against Cal, 5.16 against Virginia Tech, 6.48 against South Florida, 7.84 against Ball State, 5.92 against FAM, and 4.36 at Florida. They've not been held in the run game pretty much at all this year. The closest that they've been held is at Cal and Florida. Both of those teams held them under 4.5 yards a carry, but they're still over 4 yards a carry in both of those games. So that's problem number 1. And then that leads you to problem number 2. Because they've been able to run the football, they've been able to protect Cam Ward. And Ward right now is squarely in the Heisman race because he's looking at 10.3 yards per attempt and 24 touchdowns, 5 picks. Well, that's productivity. That's pretty dang good. And, everybody knows what he's been doing. He's been shredding teams, locating the ball, looking very comfortable in the pocket, and, yeah, just making things look pretty easy. Now, the thing that has, plagued him in the past is turnovers. And the game that they came closest to losing, or the two games that they came closest to losing, are games where they had turnovers. I said there's a path to Florida State beating Miami, but it's a small one. To me, that path is very, very simple. They're going to have to stop the run well enough to get Cam Ward in passing situations where he's not just able to sit back and sling it on neutral downs and on running downs where they're going to have the leverage. And then if they can get some pressure on him and compress the pocket some, keep him from escaping and making those plays on the run that he's made, if they can get pressure on him, the guy will drop the football. He will put the ball in danger at times. The interception that he had against Florida was inexcusably bad. A couple of them against Virginia Tech were not good. The one he had against Cal was not good. He will put the ball in danger if you can get him under pressure enough. The problem is that nobody's really been able to do that sufficiently to Miami this year. Virginia Tech and Cal came the closest. But that's your path to success. He will put the ball on the ground. You're going to get some opportunities there if you can get pressure. And he will potentially put the ball in danger as a thrower. The problem there, so there's your path to victory for Florida State. The problem is that Florida State can't, or at least hasn't, produced turnovers this season. Florida State has forced all of 3 turnovers this season. 3. That is tied for second worst in the country. So the only way that I see Florida State going out and beating this Miami team is if they go out and they do something they haven't done all season, and that's force turnovers. Now, granted, they haven't played against Cam Ward and his tendency to put the ball in danger or put the ball on the ground at times. But one of the reasons that Florida State has not turned it over is because teams have had success running the football and being in better leverage situations against them. Now, there have been some situations where, against Georgia Tech, they had an opportunity to recover a fumble in the backfield and, made a mess of it. They've had some opportunities to recover some fumbles and have screwed that up. They've had some opportunities at interceptions and have screwed that up. But like I said, the only way that I see them beating this Miami team is if Ward turns it over 3 or more times, which would mean Florida State gets as many turnovers against this Miami Florida team, as they've managed to get through 7 games so far this year. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Am I going to bet on that? Nope. That's where I think this game ultimately, that's what it hinges on. I think Miami full well knows that. And if you're Miami, why, if you're playing a Florida State team that is averaging 15 points a game and hasn't scored over 21 on the season, why would you do a whole lot to put the ball in danger? You know your magic number. You score 28 points and this game's probably over. So why would you ask your quarterback to do things that might cause turnovers in this game? I think Miami's going to play this conservatively, offensively. They're going to run it even more than they would otherwise. And they know that Florida State offensively is unlikely to be able to score enough points to threaten them. So at that point, they're going to stick with the stuff that's least likely to wind up in turnovers. I would play this very conservative if I were Miami of Florida's offensive coaching staff, and I think that's what they're going to do. I think it's going to be difficult for Florida State to hold them under, say, 4.5 yards per carry as a rush offense. I'll say, they wind up somewhere in the 4.5 yards per carry range, which puts them around 150 rushing yards. That's going to be enough, I think, right there to probably win the football game for Miami of Florida. And then offensively, in terms of Miami's passing game, I think, again, they're just going to be efficient. Not going to throw it a ton, but they'll be efficient enough. And they'll get down in the red zone. They'll run the little switch concept to Restrepo where, he goes from a from the inside slot position and works his way around the little pick on the outside, and he'll get a touchdown on that. And, they'll, get 2 or 3 touchdowns through the air, and that'll be enough. I think this is going to be that kind of game. And again, if I were on the Miami of Florida coaching staff, that's how I would approach this. So I think, somewhere in the area of, 6 to 6.5 yards per play, and, in the high 30s, maybe low 40s, maybe mid 40s is where you expect the Miami score to be. And really where Miami ends up, I think, largely depends on how many times Florida State turns it over. With no turnovers, Florida State probably gives up about 38. Somewhere in there. With a turnover or two, you're looking at 45, 42, somewhere in there, 41. And again, I don't think Florida State's going to score anywhere close to that. So again, you could probably turn this preview off right here and have a good sense of what I think is going to happen. But let's go ahead and over to the other side of the ball. Let's just extend the misery. So on the other side of the football, this is where, again, I don't think Florida State's going to have a bunch of success. The thing is, they could. So I mentioned on the other side of the ball that there's a path to victory, and that is forcing turnovers from Cam Ward, who has been a turnover machine at times. Not as much this year, but he has been at times in his past. And, if you get the pressure on him, you get some of those things, the bullets flying around him, he can become a turnover machine. There's path for victory on the defensive side. On the offensive side, Miami's back seven doesn't cover especially well. I'm not sold on their secondary. I think their secondary has some major weak points. And if Florida State had been reliable at all, if they had been explosive at all in the passing game, I'd say that's where you can score your points. If Florida State could hold on to the football at receiver at all, they're going to have opportunities to score against a Miami team that's going to play a lot of single coverage at times. I mean, what they like to do, there's not a lot of in between for them. They're going to bring 6 or they're going to bring 3. More than most teams. They'll drop 8 or they'll single cover you with 1 high. There's a lot more of that, pressure or coverage, but less true base in what Miami does than a lot of teams. They're a little bit more aggressive than most, and they also will drop and cover you. They'll mug and cover you at different times as well. So if you're Florida State, you've got to take advantage of those one-on-ones when you get them. And this is where if you have a guy that you think is actually going to catch the football, you can isolate that guy on the short side, get the one-on-one, and go to work on slants, glance routes, a fade route or two, just some takeoffs, that sort of thing. And you can win because I don't think they can cover you if you can catch the football over there. The problem is I'm not sure Florida State has a guy that can win one-on-ones right now in that context. So, Miami's biggest weakness lines up with where Florida State's not been competent. And again, you're dealing with having to throw the football to win with a pair of freshman quarterbacks as well. In a lot of ways, Florida State is coming into this game in a very similar position to what Miami came into the Florida State game last year, with Emory Williams really not yet ready. I mean, an impressive young quarterback in certain ways, but not yet ready to be the guy. And them just not being consistent enough in the passing game and, being one-dimensional. Now, Florida State so far this year has been zero-dimensional on offense. So there is that difference. But that's basically what you're looking at, is you're looking at coming in and having to be efficient, asking your freshman quarterbacks and your receivers who haven't been able to catch a cold, as I said before, is a wide receiver group that for whatever reason couldn't catch COVID in a super spreader event. you're going to have to ask those guys to go out and win in the secondary against Miami. And the reason for that is Miami's strength on defense is up front. Ruben Bain being back transforms them pretty significantly. And, I don't think we're going to see Darius Washington. Most likely, I don't think we'll see him the rest of the year at offensive tackle. So now Florida State's going to be down yet again at tackle. The question is, are they going to be willing to, give Lucas Simmons, an opportunity at tackle to maybe be the guy? Because I don't think you can win with Rob Scott at offensive tackle at this point. And, nothing against that young man. It's just a matter of injury. He's not the same player that he was 2 years ago. And so the question is, even if you do get some catches from your receivers and all of that, can you block them well enough to give your young quarterbacks enough time to be able to get the ball out? And your quarterbacks who do play are going to have a really quick clock in their head to be able to get the ball out. And that's something that Luke Kromenhoek did not do especially well last week against Duke. So I'm looking at all of this and saying the places where you can take advantage of Miami are in places where you've been especially bad. And then the places where Miami's especially strong is a place where you're not likely to be able to block them. So I don't think you're going to be able to run the football especially well because Miami's stopped the run okay on the season. Defensively, they gave up, run defense against Louisville, 5.05 yards per carry, 2.92 against Cal, 6.44 against Virginia Tech. Thing is, against Virginia Tech was able to run the quarterback some, and they got some long plays from the running backs. And you saw the same thing against Louisville. When you get your backs to the second level against their backers, against their secondary, a fast back like a Sam Singleton, say, can actually, this would be actually a decent game to maybe get a little bit of the true freshman, Mekhi Danzy. I mean, he's a guy that you get him into the second level and he's gone. But both Singleton and Danzy are guys where, if they get the ball on that second level, they can go. And Miami in the secondary, also against Florida to some degree, they've given up some big plays once guys bust through that defensive line. So much of this game for Florida State on the offensive side is about doing just enough to be able to neutralize the defensive line and not get yourself killed up front so that you can get to that soft back end. Once again, I'm not convinced that Florida State's going to be able to do that especially well. I don't think they're going to be able to run the football in this game because of the mismatch on the lines. I think the plays will be there to be made in the secondary. I'm just not convinced that they're in a position to take advantage of those plays right now. So I do think there will be more plays than they've shown so far. I think they will score more points in this game than they have in any game so far. But I don't think that that's going to be enough. So let's go ahead and get to the predictions and summary part of the show. I think we've plucked pretty close to all the feathers off this bird. All right. So all told, I think somewhere around 6.5 yards per play for Miami is to be expected. That's enough to win the football game, most likely, unless you have a rash of turnovers. And I think Florida State similarly is going to be in around their average, a little over their average per play this year. They've averaged 4.5 yards per play, which is awful. But I think somewhere in the 5.5 range is probably what you'll get in this one. I think the rivalry game and I think some of the weaknesses that Miami does have in the back end will emerge, and I think you're gonna see some taking advantage of that. I do expect a turnover or two from Ward, which will help make things a little bit more competitive, I think, in the early going. But I do think that this is going to wind up sort of a crock potting. By the fourth quarter, I think Miami starts to pull away. I'm going to go with Miami, about a 90% chance of winning this game. So I'm going to go with Miami of Florida, 41, Florida State 23 in this game. And I think there's a pretty wide delta of what could happen. I mean, it could get really ugly. And I think with the right turnover balance and, a couple of receivers making plays they haven't made but are capable of making for Florida State, this could flip. But I think that's a really low odds situation. As I mentioned, 90% chance of Miami winning. So that's what I'm going to go with. Miami, Florida 41, Florida State 23. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'll talk to you again after the game. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.